Evening everyone, and welcome to the final Sunday session for the AQA Psychology series. This is looking at the last topic of paper 3, which is issues and debates. Now this is actually quite a useful topic to be revising kind of alongside other exams, and obviously now you need it for your actual paper 3, and that's because issues and debates draws upon lots of synoptic links on things throughout the course, so it's really good for solidifying key terms and improving your AO3 in terms of those key debate style evaluations that we've become quite used to in year 13. So within this topic, there's 3 main issues in psychology that we address and 4 debates. So the 3 issues I've put on the side here of gender bias, culture bias, and social sensitivity and ethical implications. Whereas the debates are nature versus nurture, determinism versus free will, ideographic versus nomothetic, and reductionism versus holism. So I'm going to start off with the issues first of all. Now, there's so many key terms and examples that you can bring in for this topic. I've just tried to, on the whiteboard, kind of keep it to the bare minimum, just so it's not too overwhelming. But I'll give you some examples as to which AO2 points you can put in, and which examples that you should be kind of revising and practicing to prepare for those essays. So if we start off with the issues first of all, we'll look at the issue of gender bias. So you would first of all need to define, well, what is meant by gender bias? And gender bias is when there is a conflict within the research in which the gender of the participant or the researcher will influence the outcome. And this tends to be through the underrepresentation or over-exaggeration of gender differences. And it's looking at how that can impact the conclusions that we're able to make and whether or not results are generalisable. So within gender bias, there's a few kind of key concepts that you would bring into your AO1. So when we think about, well, what is the kind of knowledge versus evaluation for the issues? If you were to get a 16 marker on gender bias, your AO1 would be defining what is meant by gender bias, and it would be explaining some of the key terms that I'll talk to you about in a second. But then it's also bringing in those synoptic links and examples of things that you've learned throughout the course. Now, the way that the kind of issues and debates booklets have been crafted this year, if you remember, means that all of them have a sample essay in them. So I would definitely spend a little bit of time this week looking over those AO2 points to make sure you know which examples you can link to which issue or debate, but also kind of get looking at those example essays, because that's a good way to kind of start your prep for this topic. So if we think about the 2 main types of bias, we have alpha bias versus beta bias. So alpha bias is about an over-exaggeration between the genders. So for example, identifying significant differences between males and females with regards to certain behaviours and kind of over-exaggerating that. So for example, if we identified through research that males had better spatial navigational kind of memories, we might make this assumption and generalisation that they are better at spatial navigation tasks such as driving. So making this over-exaggerated point that men are better drivers than women because of that difference. Whereas beta bias is the opposite. This is actually failing to ignore the differences between the genders and kind of almost not acknowledging either males or females by kind of treating them exactly the same. And obviously that's equally as important to make sure that whilst we don't want differences to be exaggerated, because that can lead to negative things like labelling and stereotypes, we also want our differences to be acknowledged and recognised, and therefore not necessarily treated the same, but treated fairly. So about equity rather than equality. Now there are specific types of gender bias that you can look into, and then I'll talk to you about some of the examples. So you've got what we call androcentrism or gynocentrism. So androcentrism is about viewing things from the male perspective. Now, this is really common problem in psychology, particularly with some of the kind of older, more historical studies that we know and are very familiar with. So things in social influence like Milgram, Zimbardo, Ash. A lot of those studies were done at a time where it was predominantly male psychologists using male participants. So very much that kind of male perspective in terms of who was involved in the study and the person doing the study. And then those generalizations were essentially attempted to be made to everyone. So for androcentrism, I would use Ash as a good example, as he was a male researcher using all male participants and tried to generalize the findings about females' conformity levels, when actually other research identified later on that females were a lot more conformist than males because they had kind of different social dynamics and cared a lot more about other people's views. But the research suggests that they are the same. A good example you can use for gynocentrism. Gynocentrism is the opposite of androcentrism. It is therefore viewing things from a female perspective. So I really like using Ainsworth's Strange Situation as a good example for this, because Ainsworth was obviously a female researcher, Mary Ainsworth. So she was looking at things through that female lens and that female perspective. And she also, in her study, only looked at the mother's attachment figure as an attachment figure and how she interacted with her infant. So the results were very much only generalisable to women, and they only kind of looked at the mother's perspective. The role of the father was very much ignored here. So what we're aiming to achieve to kind of combat gender bias is this idea of universality. Now, all that means is that if a theory or a study can be generalised to all cultures and all genders, then that is said to have universality. So that is ideally what researchers are aiming for, but something that if there is gender bias present, you wouldn't be able to achieve. So your AO1 would be saying what gender bias is, making reference to some of those key terms, and then bringing in some studies or theories that you've already learned from other topics. So things like from attachment, social influence that you revised for paper 1, or you could bring in your knowledge of certain approaches or studies that you've looked at, for example, in other paper 3 topics. So for example, relationships is really easy to link to gender bias, particularly alpha bias in terms of exaggerating gender differences. You can look at studies like Buss or Clark and Hatfield, who talked about kind of mate preferences and what we look for in a partner, and that really exaggerates those differences in terms of evolution between what men and women are supposedly looking for. Another main issue in psychology is culture bias. Now again, similarly, this is looking at the extent to which research can be generalised across the world, and kind of who are these theories suitable for. So there's a few key terms in here that we've used before and that you might be familiar with. So things such as collectivist and individualistic. So remember, a collectivist culture is a culture in which individuals have kind of a shared belief or a kind of shared group set of values, and all of the goals are towards, supporting everybody as a collective. So they tend to be, Western cultures, whereas in more Westernized societies like the UK, like America, we tend to be more what we call individualistic. So we're all out to achieve our own individual goals and reach things like self-actualization. So kind of our own culture very much influences our behaviour. Now, often, if research doesn't kind of recognise the differences between the cultures and the participants that they are studying, then this can bring significant problems. So, for example, ethnocentrism is viewing something from your own cultural perspective and only being able to see it in a certain way. So bringing in knowledge of kind of the Strange Situation is a really good example for this one. So again, the fact that Mary Ainsworth was a kind of British-Canadian researcher Canadian-American researcher who based her work on Bowlby, who was a British psychologist. So again, very much this individualistic idea of what attachment should be. She identified those 3 attachment styles based on her individualistic ideals and westernized children. And then when cross-cultural variational research was done, this kind of identified some of the original problems in terms of culture bias with Mary's original study. You can also then bring in key terms like the imposed ethic or cultural relativism. So remember, cultural relativism is that in order to try and avoid culture bias, we should be acknowledging and recognising the kind of background of the participants that we are studying before we make any sort of assumptions or generalizations. And this is sometimes referred to as using an emic approach or an emic approach. So a really good example you can use here is there's a study by Rothbaum in which researchers actually spoke to Japanese mothers kind of after looking at the strange situation, and really took the time to understand their culture and their concept of MA, to understand why the children were presented as very resistant in their attachment style. And it was actually found that the mothers explained their reasoning that in their culture, they very much want their child to be emotionally dependent on them. It's seen as something that is very important and essential for creating that bond. And that is to do with the way that they raise their children. So the results actually weren't that surprising. And there could have been some detrimental kind of labelling and stereotyping to Japanese mothers that if Rothbaum didn't take the time to understand the culture first, could have fallen into that trap of being culturally biased. So there is ways that you can kind of overcome that, and again aim to achieve that universality. So yeah, your AO1, similar to with gender bias, you explain what culture bias is, you use some of the key terms such as ethnocentrism, cultural relativism, and you use your AO2 examples. So things such as strange situations are a really good example for this one, but you can also bring in knowledge of a range of other studies that you know have only been done in one area. For example, Ash or Milgram study was only done in America. If that was replicated with other participants in different places, would there have been some differences? And finally, you've got the issue of social sensitivity and ethical implications. Now, the key thing here to know is the difference between an ethical issue and a kind of ethical guideline, to make sure that we're not going down the wrong route here. So if we think about ethical issues in the BPS guidelines, an ethical issue is when there is a conflict between the needs of the researcher and the rights of the participant. So that kind of ethical dilemma or conflict between what we need to perform really meaningful research and get valid results versus what is the human rights and needs of the person being studied. So that's what we call an ethical issue. The ethical guidelines that have been put in place kind of relate to those 6 key areas that we are familiar with. So deception, informed consent, right to withdraw, protection of psychological and physical harm, privacy and confidentiality. They're kind of 6 guidelines that we need to adhere to. And if we break those guidelines, we need to be able to explain how to overcome them. So for example, if we've deceived someone, we need to give a debrief. If we've breached confidentiality, or to prevent us breaching confidentiality, we would use a pseudonym. If we can't get informed consent, because that's going to lead to demand characteristics, we might have to get prior general consent, for example, or parental if the participant is under 16. So that's what we mean by ethical guidelines and ethical issues. The issue is the conflict, the guideline is what has been put in place by the BPS to try and help minimise that problem. An ethical implication, therefore, is when there has been a breach of these guidelines, so when issues are presented, this is you evaluating to what extent is research unethical, and it's doing that cost-benefit analysis to understand, is it worth it? And one of the main ethical implications that you could be asked about in the exam is social sensitivity. So social sensitivity is the extent to which research is affecting people. Now, we're not just talking about the participants here. This could also be referring to when those results are published, who is going to see those results? How is the results going to be presented? How are the results going to be used? So it's really trying to kind of navigate and identify is the way that the research is being presented or used, is it to inform policy? Is it going to have a knock-on effect for schools and education? Is it going to lead to government funding? Like, what is the actual outcome of the result, and who could it potentially offend? So to give you a really good example, I like using aggression for this one. So if we said that biologically, people who have high levels of testosterone are likely to be aggressive. If we go down that route of using our biological explanations, we would say, right, if you've got this imbalance of neurotransmitter or this imbalance of hormone, you're likely to display this behaviour. But by doing that, the social sensitivity aspect or the ethical implication of that research is that we might be almost removing that blame and removing kind of that element of choice from a victim of crime. So by saying that actually aggressive behaviour is only down to something physical, we're almost justifying and giving a reason for somebody to do something aggressive, and therefore victims of aggressive acts. So if somebody has been harmed by someone, them themselves and their family would have kind of that social sensitivity towards that research. So it can be quite detrimental for other people in society. Now, there is a set of guidelines that have been identified to try and minimise and prevent social sensitivity from occurring. So I would definitely have a look at CYBER's guidelines. There's kind of 4 key elements that it refers to. So it refers to, is the question itself socially sensitive? So the first thing that as a researcher you would need to identify when doing your research is the way my research hypotheses phrased, could that be offensive to anybody? Is the language that's used potentially offensive, derogatory? Could any sort of claims be made just by the phrasing of my question? Once you've identified that your question is socially sensitive and it's not going to cause any problems, you would then want to look at the methodology. Again, is the way I'm collecting my data potentially going to cause some harm to people? Is anybody going to be offended or upset by the way in which I'm collecting data? So you look at the hypotheses, the methodology, you then look at the results. You look at how are the results being presented? Where are they being published? Are they being published in a newspaper, in an article, online? Who's going to actually be able to see these findings? And then finally, you're looking at kind of the funding and the long-term implications of those results. So how is that result going to be used to change things in society? Is it going to inform policy or something that could be a little bit tricky to navigate? Now, in terms of the AO3 for these issues, the AO1, so to speak, we've talked about that evaluation is all about to what extent is this issue a problem? What is the consequence of delivering or developing research that might be gender bias, culture bias, or socially sensitive? And then how are you going to fix that problem? So, for example, for gender bias, one of the problems of research that is gender bias means that often people get underrepresented and it can lead to significant implications. So for example, there's a significant portion of people that are not researched or acknowledged because gender bias as an issue itself focuses purely on kind of gender as a binary concept and looks at males versus females, but it doesn't consider, for example, non-binary individuals. So the actual issue of gender bias is gender bias, so that's a significant problem. However, we can try and fix this by using more feminist psychologies and bringing in different perspectives and doing things from both male, female and non-binary perspectives to kind of get a wider picture. In terms of things like culture bias, again, using that EMIC approach is a way to fix this problem. So you can talk about the role of kind of indigenous psychologies and Afrocentrism, so studying people or using psychologists that are kind of native to the areas that you're studying to get a real strong understanding of the culture beforehand. As we move on to the debates, now the debates are slightly different in terms of it's not just straightforward, here's the content, here's the strength and weakness. Within the evaluation of the issues and debates, you have to, as it says, create a debate. So you need to show kind of arguments for and against, and you need to create that narrative in your evaluation. So your AO3 should be thinking about the pros and cons of each side of the debate and then kind of coming to an ultimate conclusion to answer the research question. So within the 4 debates, there is a key question, and the question that you are answering should be at the forefront of your argument throughout the essay. So you should address the research question at the very start of your essay and then keep referring to or kind of referring to that point throughout your question. So, for example, if we start with nature versus nurture, this is asking the key question of what is the true origin of behaviour? Is it something that we are born with, or is it something that is learned? So that's the key question that you're kind of always referring back to. So when we think about the concept of nature, a psychologist that believes in this is referred to as a nativist, and they are somebody who believes that behaviour is innate. It's heredity, it's something that we're born with, it's down to kind of passed on genes from our parents, and that it's a hardwired behaviour. So this tends to be theories that are biological in its roots. So for example, you could use the example here of biological explanations for schizophrenia, biological explanations for OCD or aggression. Anything that has that innate physical cause would very much believe in the nature side of the debate, that the origin of behaviour is something that we've always had and that is not a learned behaviour. Whereas nurture side of the debate, a psychologist there would refer to themselves as an empiricist, and an empiricist would believe in observable behaviour that can be empirically measured, and it believes that all behaviour is learnt through environmental influences. So this idea of that tabula rasa, that we're born as a blank slate, that all of our behaviour is down to environmental exposure and things that we have kind of collected along the way. So any sort of kind of social learning type theory, behaviourist approach, any theory or concept that talks about learning and developing things over time would very much be in the camp of nurture. So remember, your AO3 is the evaluation points that you've got in the booklet, talking about the benefits of nature, the benefits of nurture, and then maybe ultimately which approach might be more appropriate. A good evaluation for this one is to talk about the role of the diatheses stress model. That actually a lot of research has suggested that an interactionist approach to explaining behaviour is much more complete and therefore much more kind of valuable rather than just focusing on nature or nurture kind of implicitly. The next debate I'm going to mention is free will versus determinism. So free will is, as you would expect in the name, it's this idea that we have free will and a choice in our own destiny and very much are in control of our own behaviour. So the best example to use here is the humanistic approach to psychology, because they believe in their overall assumptions that we are in control of our behaviour. So, for example, concepts like self-actualization, we have the free will to make the choices and the decisions in life needed to take the steps to self-actualize. We can motivate ourselves and we are very much in control. Whereas determinism is the idea that behaviour is predetermined by something out of our control, and that can be psychological, it can be physical, but it is something that we as an individual don't have control over. Now, there is different ranges or scales of determinism. So on the one end, you've got hard determinism. This is a concept that believes there is absolutely no free will, everything is preset and predetermined, and you have no control and you can't change it. Whereas soft determinism is the idea that certain aspects are predetermined, however, we have an element of choice that could maybe change the course of our actions. So a really good example of soft determinism is social learning theory, because it still believes that behaviour is predetermined by our environment and we kind of learn through modelling and observation and imitation. However, through mediational processes like paying attention, having to retain information, being able to reproduce it and being motivated, because of those kind of concepts, it suggests that we have a choice in whether or not we imitate the behaviour, and we also have a choice in who our role models are. So whilst the idea that behaviour is learned is kind of set in stone, there is a little bit of flexibility there. So that's what we would call a soft deterministic concept, because it's not as rigid as hard determinism. You also have 3 different types of determinism, and again, you can link each of these examples to different theories, studies, or approaches to help you elaborate in your AO1. So for determinism, you've got biological determinism. Does exactly what it says on the tin. This is the idea that behaviour is predetermined by our biology. So you can use any biological explanation here. Biological approach, biological explanations for OCD, aggression, schizophrenia, anything that has a physical basis is biologically deterministic. And that tends to be more in that camp of hard determinism, because we can't really change or have an influence on our physical makeup. Environmental determinism is more kind of in the realm of soft determinism. This is your learning theories and anything that's to do with the environment and kind of that conditioned stimulus response, the idea that we learn behaviour, and therefore it's determined by who we surround ourselves with. And then finally, we've got psychic determinism. Now, psychic determinism is kind of purely geared towards psychodynamic approach and theories that have this type of belief. Because this is the idea that the role of the unconscious mind is very much influencing and driving our behaviour. So our childhood experiences and our unconscious mind is what predetermines things that happen to us. So for example, things like the structure of personality or the psychosexual stages of development, that is all predetermined behaviour that happens in childhood as a result of our unconscious, and we wouldn't really have control over that. If we then think about reductionism versus holism, so reductionism is this idea that we take something really complex within human behaviour, like aggression or phobias or whatever concept it is you're trying to explain. We take that really complicated behaviour and we simplify it down, a little bit like a funnel. We funnel it down to just one single unit, okay, one simple concept. So it's all about making things too simplistic and studying it in great detail. Now, obviously, if we think about the benefit of this, we can study it more scientifically using empirical methods, and it's easier to kind of go into much more depth because you're only studying one concept. However, by doing that, we might potentially miss other explanations or reasons for behaviour, which a holistic approach would be better suited for. So in terms of reductionism, again, there are 2 main types: biological reductionism and environmental, so reducing it down to something physical or to something environmental. And again, you can give relevant examples of any kind of learning or biological theory. Research also talks about what we call the level of explanation, and it says that sometimes theories or the same behaviour can be explained using different levels of explanation. So the lowest level of explanation would be your biological explanations, things that are the most reductionist, because they explain it on that very simple surface level. Here's the physical characteristics. So if we take the example of aggression would, using a biological explanation or a low level of explanation, would say we are aggressive because we've inherited the relevant genes for that. A kind of medium level of explanation is your more psychological explanation. So this is anything behaviourist, cognitive, kind of psychodynamic, anything that focuses on you as an individual, but looking at more wider aspects, things that could be influenced or interacted with the environment for. And then right at the top, we've got the highest level of explanation and therefore the least reductionist. So kind of, I don't know if you can see the diagram here, but the higher up you go, the more broad and holistic the explanation becomes, the more narrowed and focused and reductionist, the lower the explanation becomes. So a high level of explanation is what we call social and cultural explanations. So if we think about this same kind of behaviour of aggression, using the biological explanation, we said you inherit genes. If we then use psychological explanations, we might suggest, for example, that this individual has aggressive role models and that they are learning that behaviour from others. Whereas socially and culturally, this is looking at societal factors and the individual as a whole. So we might actually say that because of the cost of living crisis, there's a reason that somebody's displaying aggression, because they're frustrated at not being able to pay their bills and they're taking that anger out on somebody else. And if we compare that to just the concept of holism, this is about viewing an individual as a whole, looking at every component part. So then biologically, psychologically, cognitively, kind of every aspect of their being to try and explain behaviour. So it is obviously the best and most complete way to understand an individual, but it's very difficult to empirically study somebody in a holistic way. And therefore the main theories or concepts that are holistic also tend to be the theories that are not particularly scientific. So for example, the humanistic approach views everyone as an individual and that they are unique. It believes that we have to do things holistically, but it also is not a scientific theory. So there's pros and cons with this kind of idealistic view of holism. And then finally, the last debate that we'll look at is what we call idiographic versus nomothetic. So nature versus nurture answered the question of what is the origin of behaviour. Determinism versus free will answered the question about to what extent are we in control of behaviour. Reductionism versus holism is looking at the best way to understand behaviour in a simplistic, really focused form, or looking at us as a whole. Idiographic nomothetic is linked to research methods. This is answering the key question of what is the best way to study human behaviour? Is it to do a very idiographic approach which focuses on uniqueness and the individual, or is it better to take a nomothetic approach and try to create general laws? So the idiographic approach, if we think about that word idio or idios, meaning individual or one's own, this is referring to studying small groups of people using very qualitative methodology, so things like interviews, case studies, trying to get very rich in-depth data about individuals or small groups, and kind of, treating them as an individual. So it's not trying to make generalizable laws to everyone. It's all about trying to explain an individual's behaviour on their own basis and kind of identifying their unique components and what makes them them. So, for example, things like the humanistic approach or the psychodynamic approach would be more idiographic because they focus on the individual's experiences. So, for example, your own individual unconscious mind or your own individual childhood. Whereas nomothetic tends to be more behavioural, cognitive, biological explanations. And this comes from the word nomos, which means law. And this is about creating that generalizable data that can be used to explain mass behaviour in a wider population. So they tend to favour more quantitative methods to allow for statistical analysis, and they definitely value much larger sample sizes. So doing things like meta-analysis, experiments, looking at kind of government statistics, and kind of using still primary data, but also a lot more secondary data to get large volumes of data about individuals and try to make generalizations. So any theory that essentially, the more empirical a theory, the more likely it is to use a nomothetic approach to explaining behaviour, whereas an idiographic approach tends to be more in depth, but it might lack some of that kind of falsifiability, and if we think about the features of a science, the idiographic in comparison is less scientific. However, it is still essential for understanding human behaviour. And often a lot of theories nowadays will use elements of both. They will kind of almost adopt a bit of a hybrid between the two approaches to studying behaviour, and will use a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. First study individuals in great depth, and then maybe adopting nomothetic methods thereafter if they find something that might be worth looking at in more detail. So that's obviously like a whistle-stop tour just of the essential key bits of knowledge and examples. In terms of preparing for issues and debates, I would say that the best and kind of main way is purely essay plans. Make sure that you've done an essay plan or some practice timed essays for each of the 4 debates, so nature versus nurture, idiographic versus nomothetic, free will versus determinism, and reductionism versus holism. I would also remember you could get an 8 or a 16 marker in any of the 3 issues. So I'll put a little reminder on the story, or when I do the Instagram live, I'll go through the kind of questions that haven't come up in a little while. I'll put a reminder on for that one in terms of which ones might be more likely. But I would definitely kind of make sure you've done a plan for each of the possible essay questions, and especially make sure that you're hot on your terminology and your applications, because you can get lots of short answer, multiple choice or definition questions on the keywords from your AO1, but also this is going to just further improve the quality of your AO3 in your other essays. So if you confidently can explain what is meant by psychic determinism or levels of explanation, or you can bring in the use of, you can identify when a study is using idiographic or nomothetic methods, that's just going to make your evaluation stand out from the rest if you're using that more sophisticated terminology and bringing in knowledge of issues, debates and approaches. So for example, if you're doing an essay question in relationships, you could bring in knowledge of gender bias, things like andro and gynocentrism when talking about evolutionary explanations. So don't just think that these key terms live in the box of issues and debates. You can start to branch out and utilise them to help strengthen your AO3 in other questions. So like I said in my previous videos, you can comment down below, you make sure you're watching the videos as a basis for revision, and then you're going through that full cycle, doing practice questions and getting feedback. If you've got any questions at all, I will be over on the college Instagram doing a live stream the night before the paper, so kind of towards the end of this week. So if you've got any specific questions about issues and debates or about any of the paper 3 topics, then make sure that you tune in for that. Okay, thanks guys, good luck.